आज इंटरनेट सिर्फ आधे अधूरे सच और पूरे झूठ में डूबा हुआ है। किसी के पास गहराई से सोचने का या शांति से सुनने का वक्त ही नहीं है। हम एक ऐसा शांत कोना बनाने की कोशिश कर रहे हैं। Nope, not your ordinary podcast for entertainment.
Nope.
What were the challenges with the history textbooks, and how did you deal with it while you were at, kind of revising these textbooks with NCERT?
Well, before I begin, I want to emphasize one thing, because this is often discussed and debated about rewriting of history textbooks and revision. I would like to emphasize that rewriting of history is necessary and desirable. And revision of textbooks is again extremely essential. The question is what kind of rewriting and what kind of revision that we are talking about. किस तरीके का बदलाव, किस तरीके का संशोधन अच्छा है, किस तरीके का नहीं है, किस दृष्टिकोण से होता है, किस दृष्टिकोण से नहीं होता है, और उसका implication क्या है. This is what I think is very important to remember. So, and that's what I would like to discuss and argue when I'm talking about the present changes as well as the past changes. That it was in 2005 that we were asked to rewrite the existing established textbooks of the time. It was this request was something which excited some of us, but we were also slightly apprehensive and anxious. कुछ डर भी था, क्योंकि the existing textbooks of that time were written by our teachers, our mentors. They were not representing some other kind of histories of some other political imaginings. And they were written by people, by historians who were extremely famous, and their textbooks in the 1960s and 70s, which were produced in the 60s and 70s, were wonderful textbooks of the time. We all read them, we all admired them, and in fact some of the textbooks were taught in the BA classes also. I still remember my BA teacher, Robi Chatterjee, asked us to read Bipin Chandra's school textbook as one of the background textbooks of the time. So they were written by Satish Chandra, Romila Thapar, Bipin Chandra, and all stalwart historians of the time. So replacing their textbook was something which was not so easy. But we had seen the textbooks which have been produced all over the world, in England, in Europe, in South Africa, in Japan, in many other places. And we had seen that textbooks can look really interesting. They can be interactive, they're full of images, they're full of colors. They can be attractive for students rather than something which they dread to open, the textbooks. And we felt that that's something, it would be nice to do something like that for Indian children, for Indian schools. And it would be exciting to do that. And this was a chance to do that. We also were aware of the existing education and what the educationists have been saying all the while for many decades, that children are curious learners, and उनका जो उत्सुकता है, we need to tap that curiosity. And children are also active learners. They are not just passive, sitting there wanting to just hear the teachers. It's at that time that their attention flags. And we have to tap their curiosity and see them as active learners who are interacting with texts, who are interacting with what is going on, who are interacting with what is offered to them. And therefore, we need to offer them something which makes it possible for that interaction to happen. And we had also seen, and we had been told repeatedly by educationists, that children don't learn only through words. It's not what you write, but what they see, the images, paintings, texts, cartoons, photographs of figures, spaces, all that matters. And that's what excites imagination. And I always felt that it would be wonderful to have Indian textbooks where all these things could be brought in. And this was a chance to do that. And in some sense, we were also keen that the history that is offered in the textbook is a history which also reflects the history of our time. In the 30 years that the earlier textbooks had been published, history had changed. There were, gender histories, ecological histories, cultural histories, history from below, subaltern histories, histories of everyday life. A whole range of exciting new fields had opened up. And that was not there in the textbooks of the time. And many of us felt that it would be wonderful to have cutting-edge histories, the new traditions of history writing, new imaginations within history as part of the textbook. Written in a simple way to the extent that school children can understand, but that should be made available to the children to interact with. Can we not have all that come in to the textbooks? So we try to do three or four things which I'd like to talk very briefly. One, that history, in a sense, from the 70s and 80s, had become a history which was no longer of dynasties, about the dominant people, about the elites. Our teachers and others who wrote at that time, they had already started writing in some way about the peasants and the workers and others. But there were many other social groups whose histories were not there in the textbooks. What about the pastoralists? What about the peddlers? What about the beggar on the street? What about the nomads? What about the artisans? The artisans in Madhya Pradesh or in Orissa, they also have a life, they also have a history, which they are keen to know, which we ought to know. An interaction between social groups and communities can be there only when we can empathize with their life, with their past, and know a little about their past. So our effort was to bring, to create a more inclusive history, जिसमें कि आम जनता के बारे में हो. So the history of different social groups come in. So we wrote about the history of the nomads. There are chapters on nomads, there are chapters on pastoralists, on tribals, and there are chapters on social groups which are otherwise not represented in history, by farmers and peasants and by the aboriginals. Like, history of America very often is seen as history of development, growth, and their expansion of the cotton expansion or the other expansion is seen as a history of expansion of agriculture. But that's also a history of displacement. Local native populations, aboriginals, are being displaced. Can't we have a history which talks about development, expansion of cotton industry, growth and modernity, but also talks of the implication of all that, the displacements which take place? Different social groups, how do they experience modernity? How do they experience transformation and change? So we moved from America to Australia. There again, expansion of the white colonization also meant displacement of aborigines and all. So can't we have histories of those in schools where they know that white Australia is also an Australia built on the displacement of native population? So we tried to integrate as much of these histories within the textbooks.
It was like a more comprehensive.
Yes, more inclusive, more comprehensive in that sense. And this was also a time, the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s is a time all social groups from all over India are demanding their rights. There is a fight for recognition, their fight for representation, and that requires that they are also represented in textbooks in some form or the other. So this was an attempt to be more inclusive, to bring the social, the history of all social groups within the text that we produce for the children. Secondly, what we wanted was a history which was sensitive to the fact that history is, history is not simply about big events. It's not simply about the great wars that are fought or the dynastic battles that go on. History is about everyday life also. That the clothes we wear, or the print that we read, or the food that we eat, or the games we play, everything has a history. And children should know about the history of everything, and that's actually historical sensibility. That everything you look around has a history. Can we make the student realize that the clothes he wears has not been there for all times to come, but it is of a particular type, it has a history of its own. And clothes can actually show the history of domination and subordination, of colonization, of nationalism. Swadeshi is a history of clothes. It's a battle around clothing. So acculturation and civilization is about clothing people, that we go to Africa and clothe the natives. And there's exciting new work being done, for instance, on simply things like the Pear soap. The advertising of the Pear soap, where the blacks will be transformed, skin will be transformed into white if you use that's a way of colonization. So what we do in everyday life has a history of domination, subordination, a history of nationalism, colonialism, imperialism, everything gets linked up here. So we therefore wanted all that in some form to come in. So for instance, from class 6, 7, 8, we tried to integrate some of all this in the chapters that were being written. But in 9 and 10, we had an entire section which was on a history of everyday life, in a sense. In class 9, we had a wonderful chapter. Class 9, we had a wonderful chapter on cricket. That cricket also has a history. All children are hooked on to cricket. A lot of them are excited about cricket. But do we realize that cricket came as a colonial sport? It was part of the gentleman's game. It was supposed to demonstrate, represent, and assert the power of the colonizer, their capacity to be for fair play, their capacity to be gentle and be gentlemanlike, their capacity to play and defeat the natives. And this is appropriated in West Indies and in India, in other places, as a game which questions colonial power and rule. We play the same game but defeat the colonizers in their game. Ranjit Singh was so hated by that he created anxiety amongst the British because he could beat the British in their own game. And there's a wonderful book, Beyond the Boundary, which shows how cricket becomes a thing of nationalism in the West Indian scenario. And therefore, cricket, football, all these things are games whose histories we could talk about, and children will be interested in. We had a chapter on clothing, the history of clothing, and how clothing gets linked up with questions of caste and domination. Who can clothe the body and who cannot? Who can wear garments and who cannot? Which women are allowed to? Upper caste domination implied lower castes were not allowed to do certain things. Can we really discuss all that in school textbooks? So we did that, and the history of novels, history of clothing, history of cricket, and history of print, all that became part of our textbook. In class 9 and 10, there are chapters on that. Then there was another problem which was there in the earlier textbooks as well as textbooks all over the world, which is a Eurocentric focus. That हमारा नजरिया यूरोप में लगा हुआ है. मतलब we think Europe is the site and space for modernization, growth and development, and we have to imitate, emulate the model of the West, and we will be judged and assessed according to our capacity to follow the Western model. No, that's not history. That's not the way it should be. We should be able to know the history of all over the world. And modernization and development can take on different forms. It doesn't have to follow the Western. So the celebration of Europe in all historical discussions and an attempt to see the model of Europe as the model that other countries and other nations have to emulate, as if industrialization there and agricultural development there, modernization there is something which would allow us to judge our kind of industrialization, our modernization, our agricultural development. If there is Renaissance there, therefore we have to discover Renaissance यहाँ पर हुआ था क्या नहीं. Industrialization, is it distorted industrialization, adequate industrialization, will be judged in terms of whether it conforms to the parameters and index of Western European industrialization. So this is something which had become part of the discussion from the 80s and 90s. Indian and colonial historians began arguing that Europe cannot be the measure of all historical development. We have to shift our gaze. हमारा नज़रिया बदलना पड़ेगा. इस तरीके से नहीं चलेगा. तो then we had to discuss and decide how do we bring all this into children's textbook. Do we just talk about industrial development there and industrial development here? So the solution we found was to reimagine two classes, 9 and 10, as classes in which we will talk about the contemporary world or modern world. But we will think of the modern and the history of the modern as something which is in which all nations participate. It's not they create and we imitate. It is that we are also part of that making of the modern world. So is Africa, so is Indonesia, so is Latin America. Every nation, every country, every continent in its own specific way participates in the making of the modern world, and we have to understand how they participate, what their contribution is, what is the specific form in which modernity develops through that process. To do this, we broke up the structure of the textbooks into 3 components. Therefore, the first part was political processes, second part economic processes, and third part, which I've already mentioned in some way, is about everyday life. So in the first part, in class 9, we dealt with the way certain historical political forces become part of the modern world. So liberalism, democracy and other things, how does it develop in the West? Then fascism, how does it develop? There is an excellent chapter on fascism. How does fascism develop? What does it tell us about the crisis of democracy? It emerges within developed countries, and what happens at that time? It resonates with changes and developments in the world today. And we had a chapter on socialism, which is the third theme which dominates modern world, which shifted focus to Russia. And critically assessed the Russian situation. In class 10, in the political thing, we took up only nationalism. So it's not that we have to cover everything about. It's whether we can make students understand certain things properly and ask historical questions about historical events. And once they start doing it, they can use their capacity to question in discussing other historical phenomena. So we did nationalism. And we moved from nationalism in Europe to nationalism in India to nationalism in Vietnam. 3 types of nationalism. How does it develop? And in the economic section, we discussed urbanization, we discussed industrialization, but we also discussed in over 9 and 10, the history of forestry, the history of nomadism and pastoralism, the history of artisanal production, all these things discussed. And each chapter we shifted, for instance, in forestry we shift from India to Indonesia. In pastoralism we shift from India to Maasai land. In agriculture we shift from India to England to America. So there are different kinds of comparisons being made. So we see the emergence of the modern through this process which is going on in different parts. And in the third part, we talked about everyday life, which again is part of the making of the modern. Clothing, cricket, novels. We can't imagine modernity without print culture. without being able to read, whether it is a textbooks or a newspaper or even a... So when did print come up? What did it imply? How enlightenment, so the enlightenment that we talk about is actually so closely linked with the emergence of print culture, so that ideas could circulate, people could read, think, question. You didn't only hear and accept what was being heard. So this is how we tried to bring in this question of rethink the question of Eurocentrism in the textbook. The fourth thing that was important, I think, for us was the fact that history, when we present to students, should not be presented as truths which they cannot question, as conclusions and ideas and arguments for which we have had a final answer. We cannot talk to students purely in an authoritative voice, the authoritative voice of the knowledge holder. We know and we tell, and therefore truths to be given, circulated through the textbooks. We had to show, and we felt that very strongly, we had to show how historical knowledge is formed, how historians read sources, what kind of sources are there, what are their limits, unka kamiyan kya hai, what potential do they have, how do we read the police report and the newspaper, the diary and the private diary and the public discourse, how do we read inscriptions, archaeological finds, how do we read court chronicles, or how do we read paintings, how do we make sense of paintings to talk about history. So we did integrated this from class 6, 7, 8 onwards. But in class 12, each of the chapters, I think I've got a volume there. Yeah. If you see the chapters, they are all on a specific source. And we tell the story of the theme that we're dealing through one or two sources, and we make the student aware of the limits of the source and the possibilities and potential of the source, so that they come to know how history is thought about, written and talked about. We also wanted them to know that there are historical debates which go on, which is part of this rethinking that I talked about. Rethinking of history is through dialogues, debates and discussions. And class 11 textbook deals, all the themes deal with these debates kind of. So there was a argument about in the textbooks, in assumption in our that we need to sensitize students to the way historical knowledge develops over time. The fourth or fifth, another theme that was important was to make the textbook gender sensitive. Feminist historians from the 1970s and 80s had made us aware that everything in the world is gendered, whether it is work, whether it is domestic life, whether it is leisure or pleasure, whether it is about writing or the text. Who has the right to read? Who has the right to write? Who has the right to public right to think and speak and articulate? So can we make students can we make them sensitive to the gendered nature of social life and culture and politics? So we integrated this gender sensitivity in subtle ways, I think, from class 6, 7, 8 onwards. Very small questions, small in different ways we integrated this. But we also had chapters in which this was substantially dealt with, and the nature of work, the difference between men and women, the fact that certain people were allowed to read the sacred texts, other people were not allowed. The women were not allowed. Shudras were not allowed to read the Vedas. So now just posing questions, making suggestions, making students aware of the fact that gender discrimination and gender matters. This is something which again was part of her. And similarly, there were other issues like ecological issues. Ecological issues had become so important in the from the 1970s and 80s, and ecological history had become very, very important. So ecological histories in India had become. Ram Guha had written extensively, Richard Gough had written extensively, and many of us were doing ecological history. In the West, from Worcester to others, Crosby, Worcester, many other historians had written wonderful books on ecological history, which made us aware that, you cannot think of development and growth without thinking about the ecological consequences and environmental consequences of modernity, growth, development, industrialization. Agricultural development and agricultural change has its ecological and environmental implication. Green revolution has its ecological implication from soil quality to the kind of changes that happens to the water level. When you have 3 rice crops being grown, it may lead to increased rice yields, but the water level will go down and water scarcity will happen. Now, therefore, how do you, and not just simply that, that leads to the kinds of problems of pollution that you have in Delhi, because in order to actually burn the husk after the harvest, in order to clear the husk after the harvest, you have to burn it. And when you burn it, it creates pollution. So a whole range of things get linked up. And earlier economists and historians very often were obsessed with productivity increase, GDP increase, productivity increase, growth and modernity. So we had to understand the implication of development and change, and also understand that everything in nature has a history. Water has a history, rivers have a history. Rivers के ऊपर बहुत किताबें लिखी गई हैं सारी दुनिया में. Worcester has written a wonderful book on America. There are histories of fish and rivers in all over Europe. In India, there are so many wonderful books on rivers which are being written. Water, river, irrigation. Similarly about forests and forestry, pastures, forests, water, air. Everything we could be writing history about. And so we integrated all that in our things. There are chapters, as I said already, on pastures, on grasslands, on forests, making students sensitive to it. And finally, I would say, we tried to make the texts as attractive as possible. They are not texts which we felt are word heavy, text heavy. So we had boxes, we had images, we had photographs, we had cartoons. We did a lot of research on these, and images and photographs were integrated in the text, were there in the text, not simply as illustrations, but they were alternative supplementary texts. We were persuading the students to interact with the text, to interpret the interact with the image, to interpret the image. So very often images are seen as illustrations. Usko, you're making that page look interesting, but it is something more. You are making the student interact with an image and read the image. Can we train them to be visually sensitive? And that was again one part. And try to integrate exercises, activities within it, which makes it interactive. So that was our pedagogical effort. How much we were successful, that only the readers and teachers can tell. But I know that these texts have 2 kinds of problems. That textbook is the pehla pehlu. This is the first step. Teachers' training is extremely important in order to make the text actually meaningful, and because teachers will teach in their own way, and if teacher training is not there, then the teachers will continue to teach in their own as they have taught earlier. That's always been a problem all over the world. So teacher training has to be a very important part of educational change. Other thing is the exam system. If you continue to ask standard old-style questions, then the student will not be encouraged to read. Very often the teachers tell the student, "Wo box ko bhul jao." Now, boxes are very important in our text as interact. So, exam-oriented प्रिपरेशन कराते तो बॉक्स एंड इमेजेस को भूल जाते हैं और बस टेक्स्ट को और उसको क्वेश्चन फॉर्म और आंसर फॉर्म में ट्रांसलेट हो जाता है वो. सो दैट्स द प्रॉब्लम वेरी ऑफन.
So challenges when you kind of, there was one which was the history was not comprehensive enough. There was no mention of history of basically how did we adapt to what we wear, to what we eat. These things were broadly missing, and it was not as comprehensive, or kids were not interacting with imagery as they should have. Right? These were the issues broadly, and this whole European standard and European perspective and gaze on our history. So these were the broad problems.
Yeah. Some of those
some of
issues.
those
And this, the pedagogic issue, I know, the text being authoritative, that this is the knowledge that we give, versus a text which
leads towards curiosity.
Interactive, stimulates the curiosity of the student in a, so to what extent it does is something to be judged there. Yeah.
There was not a crisis, but there was a scope for improvement when you associated with NCERT. Now I don't know how I see it. Now I see what books or authors are trying to do and what we're trying to feed kids is probably a crisis. So I don't know how you see it, what's happening to textbooks currently and how kids are being taught history.
Yeah.
What do you think about what is happening
changes
currently?
that are coming about? One is that 2005, 6, 7 was a very special period. Krishna Kumar was the director of the time, and it was a very exciting time of a lot of interaction amongst not just historians. As I said, there are 40, 50, 60 of us were regularly involved. Teachers, NGOs, educationists, all of us were involved in the making of the history textbook. But this was being done across the disciplines, and there was a lot of discussion across disciplines that was taking place. But now, in the last, since 2013, 14, and much more bit after 15, 16, there's been a persistent attack on the textbooks in a different way. एक तरह का अटैक जो है, क्रिटिसिज्म है, वो सबको पता है. कि मुगलों का इतिहास एलिमिनेट कर दिया गया. मुगल्स, इस्लामिक हिस्ट्री, मुगल हिस्ट्री, and anything to do with Sultanate and Muslims, that's been reducing. Now that's something which we can see very easily. In class 7, which was on Madhyakalin Itihas, medieval history, there were 2 chapters, one on the Sultanate and one on the Mughals, in which there were 2 pages. We had condensed the dynastic history of Mughals. Earlier, Mughals, Humayun, Akbar, Shah Jahan, Aurangzeb, सबके ऊपर chapters होते थे. We did away with that and did broader history of medieval period, किस तरीके का हो रहा है. उसमें 2 पेज रखे थे हमने कि स्टूडेंट्स को पता चले जो नाम क्या है, कौन कौन थे, उनके पीरियड क्या है, उनके इमेजेस जो फोटोग्राफ्स पेंटिंग्स में मिलते हैं वो क्या क्या. सल्तनत एंड मुगल वो दोनों पेज निकाल दिए गए. देन क्लास 11 में इस्लामिक लैंड का एक चैप्टर था जिसमें इस्लामिक, दैट्स नॉट ऑन इंडिया सो मच, इस्लामिक लैंड्स में क्या डेवलपमेंट हो रहे हैं medieval पीरियड में, in terms of music, texts, images, religion, what kinds of changes are taking place within the Ottoman Empire and Islamic lands and other places. That was being discussed. Usko हटा दिया गया. Class 12 में, medieval history में, as I said, the class 12 के chapters सारे source based थे. So एक chapter था Chronicles and Kings के ऊपर. उसमें ये था कि क्रॉनिकल्स पढ़ के, कोर्ट क्रॉनिकल्स पढ़ के किस तरीके से लोग इतिहास लिख सकते हैं, कोर्ट क्रॉनिकल्स का कमियां क्या हैं, उसके पॉसिबिलिटीज़ क्या हैं, उससे क्या हम जान सकते हैं, क्या नहीं जान सकते हैं. किस तरीके से पढ़ा जा सकता है और कैसे वो उसका इस्तेमाल हुआ है, ये सब के बारे में था. और उसके थ्रू अ डिस्कशन ऑफ क्रॉनिकल्स वी डिस्कस्ड Mughal Empire. It was not a chapter on Mughal Empire, but it was primarily in Court and Chronicles as part of 12 chapters on 12 or 13 different sources. उस chapter को भी drop कर दिया गया. So Mughal, there is a very clear project of eliminating all discussions of Mughals and Muslims. So this is still, I would say, not the kind of changes and developments we see in textbooks in the BJP states. If you see the Rajasthan textbooks and other textbooks, there's a villainization of Muslims and the Mughals and others. Here it is elimination, displacement of जो textbook से निकाल दिया गया. So this is one process which has been taking place. Second, and I think सारी public discussion is focus जो है ये मुगल और इस्लामिक मुगल का जो elimination हो रहा है इसके ऊपर. लेकिन there are many other things happening. एक तो है जो कि मैं कहूँगा कि sanitization of Hindu history and caste history. You know, 2015 में एक रिट पिटिशन चंडीगढ़ में कोर्ट में फाइल होता है जो कि नेशनल काउंसिल ऑफ हिस्टोरिकल रिसर्च एंड कंपैरेटिव स्टडीज़ के थ्रू थे, वो जो कि आरएसएस बीजेपी के साथ जुड़ी हुई है. उन्होंने कोर्ट के रिट पिटिशन फाइल किया कि इन टेक्स्ट बुक में सारे मिथ्या, all falsehoods are being preached in this, and they produced 182 objections to it and produced about 300-400 pages of annexures and very substantive 100-150 pages of objections and critical comments.
And these objections were towards discussing the caste practices.
Yes, and that is that वो जब हमारे पास आया तो NCERT sent that. Till then NCERT was discussing with the chief editor, which I was there, and the editors, you know, Kumkum Roy, Sunil Kumar, Kunal Chakravarti, Monica Juneja, all लोग जो editors थे, नारायणी गुप्ता, सब editors के साथ discussion होता था ये. When we read that, we were really surprised because all the reform movements, 19th century के जो reform movements हैं, जो Hindu reformers who are talking of the evils of the caste system or arguing for a better position for women and criticizing the earlier patriarchal norms from sati to widow remarriage, उन सब का criticism किया गया. जो history textbooks में ये सब नहीं होगा, ये बदनाम किया जा रहा है. ये ब्राह्मण लोग ऐसे नहीं थे, patriarchy ऐसे नहीं थी. And ancient India में भी जो मेंशन जहाँ पर भी कास्ट सिस्टम का, वर्ना सिस्टम का क्रिटिसिज्म था, वो सारा एलिमिनेट करने के लिए. तो उन्होंने 150 पेज 200 पेज का comments page. We also wrote about 150 pages answering all the comments that and defending the things, and NCERT stood by us and NCERT did not accept it. But after that, many of those changes are taking place in the textbooks, and from the ancient history textbooks, for instance, our past one, this is the class 6 textbooks which is there. Small changes are being done or paragraphs are being eliminated which appear to be small, but they are not really small. So there, for instance, just to give you an example, there is, I forget the page number, there is on page 55, 56, there is a description of the Varna system. And it is said that in the later Vedic period, the Varna system was devised by the priests. Later Vedic period, Varna system comes up and it describes the function of the Brahmins, Kshatriyas, Vaishyas, Shudras, etc. And then it says the priests may link the Varna system to the question of birth, and they introduce the question of untouchability, the issue, and that chut achut tab se shuru hua, later Vedic periods. The fact that priests are introducing all this, and the fact the reference to the chut achut and untouchability, that is eliminated. The reference to the priests is eliminated, and the fact there was another paragraph which said not everyone did not accept the caste system. There were protests against it. People refused to accept it. Some people thought it was unjust. Some people argued for equality. Ye paragraph ko bhi eliminate kar diya. So what happens as a consequence is that the Varna system is stated as something which is natural, as if it's something to be followed. Small changes actually have deeper implications and meanings. So इस तरीके के changes शुरू हुए.
Bigger motives they're trying to achieve with small changes.
Yes. See, there is what is happening therefore is an argument that caste system cannot be criticized, Brahminism cannot be criticized, Hindu world and Hindu society cannot be criticized. And anything which makes the student critical of the society is something which is problematic, and Sanatan Dharma argument is something which we cannot question. There's a third thing which is happening, which is again interesting. All our effort to integrate the history of everyday life is something which is now being negated. They have dropped the chapter on cricket, they have dropped the chapter on clothing, they have dropped the chapter on novels. All these things are seen as subjects which, should not be part of history. So all these chapters become part of, are excluded from the textbooks. This is the third theme which we can very clearly see that, and the focus on the lower caste, this inclusive history that we were trying to develop, and the history of all social groups and classes, there again, there is a change. All the chapters dealing with the nomads, or the artisans and workers. There was a wonderful chapter on the agarias of Madhya Pradesh, iron smelters of Madhya Pradesh, their history and their life, their culture, their work, that was removed. All mention of dasas and dasis, which is quite stunning actually, all the mention of dasas and dasis and karmakaras in ancient India, all that is removed. So you can't mention dasas and dasis, and you can't talk of slaves in any form in ancient India. So there is this process of sanitization of history, of Hindu history. Just as much there is a process of elimination of Islamic Muslim history. And there is a celebration of the Sanatan, there is a celebration of the ancient past, which is part of the politics of the present in a certain sense. So that's something which is really worrying. Now that two new textbooks have come out, but there is, we have to still see what they do in class 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, what kind of texts they...
But this sort of alteration done to kind of justify the political will of people today by just eliminating or changing things in the past, where does that leave the student who is trying to study this history?
Yeah, that's a broad question. That's the problem of textbooks, that if you are doing all these changes, and there is very clearly a reversion back, a return back to dynastic histories, to political histories and cultural histories, and the kind of transformation, the exciting new things that was happening with history, all that is being eliminated. Now, the students will be fed on this history. The idea that what we need to know is the history of ancient past and Sanatan Dharma and Brahminical culture without any questioning, critique and understanding, not just from outside but within, even the critique from inside Hinduism is not something which is permissible, will obviously offer students an extremely flat conception of the past, and a conception of the past as a past where only Hindu culture and history really matters. I can't say what they will do with the Mughals and the Islamic and other culture, in what form it will come up, but in the way that it is developing in the class 6 and 7, there is a focus on, again, the Hindu dynasties, extended focus on the Hindu dynasties. The old argument that the Gupta age is a golden age, something which has been criticized over the last 30, 40 years, that no age is a golden age. It was golden age of the Guptas was a colonial invention. And the colonial historians suggested there was a golden age, the Orientalists suggested there was a golden age of ancient Indian culture and civilization, and that was destroyed by the Muslims, and there was a lot of criticism of the Islamic Muslim rule in colonial writings. That's taken over by those who celebrate Hindutva histories, etc. And the golden age argument is returning again. And you can't consider any age as golden, because there are problems with each age, and there are limits to what happens in that age, and there are a lot of criticisms of this whole idea of the golden age in ancient India. It is a time, it has been shown and argued by Uma Chakrabarti to many others, when patriarchy is established much more firmly. It is a time when caste order becomes much more rigid. It's a time many other things are happening, which is something which we need to be critical about. So we are going back to that kind of a history once again. So I just hope that we can continue to have in future, at some distant future, histories which are more inclusive, histories which again broaden the minds of students to all kinds of developments and changes.
Yeah, that's one very positive, optimistic outlook. But what they've done to history in terms of the Mughal history, and how they have taken all critiques of Hinduism or caste or Brahmanism out of the textbooks. If they keep continuing like this, how do you think our political struggle against the British to attain freedom, how do you think they look at this chapter then?
See, the thing is, there has to be a public discussion on all this over time. One of the things is historians talking, people talking continuously about the kind of histories that is being written, analyzing them, circulating them, and offering criticism, which makes historians and students realize the kind of histories which is being produced. But also, history textbooks ultimately, NCERT or the CBSE board makes class 12 and 10 textbooks compulsory. One hopes that alternative textbooks circulate. Even now, NCERT textbooks is only one type of textbooks, one set of textbooks which circulate. Every publisher publishes its textbooks. So one hopes that other textbooks will be produced offering other kinds of texts, other kinds of histories which are more imaginative, more inclusive, more exciting, and that will circulate and compete with these textbooks. But within every society there is a phase when there are issues and problems multiply in every sphere. And we see that those kind of problems in the sphere of education today, the kind of cuts which are happening, the kind of controls which are being established, kind of freedoms which are being restricted, and the kind of censorship which is taking place in the case of textbooks to other kinds of ideas. And that's something which teachers, students, citizen at large will have to continue to fight for, and hope that through that there will be a time when these textbooks too will change, and alternative textbooks will emerge again. But that's an optimistic projection of a future. We'll have to
Wait and see.
think of how that will make possible. On the question of history, I would like to say that the main thing is students have to develop a historical sensibility and itihasik bodh in some way, where they can ask questions about history, and therefore that curiosity is something which will lead them to search for other material also. And I think podcasts, discussions like what you are offering to the audience and many others are doing, all that will play a part in producing. In fact, what will happen to textbooks in a digital age is something which is still being debated, whether textbooks will remain or whether digital forms will take over and undermine the power and authority of the textbooks. In many countries, they shifted to digital forms, but they have reverted also to textbooks. And now there is experiment in both hybrid forms. But when you move to digital form, there is a democratization which takes place where the teachers and students actually can define what is being studied, read, and thought about. In some curriculum, like the IB curriculum, they don't have textbooks in the school curriculum. It is devised, there are certain set structures and goals that we have to achieve, and that is done collectively through teachers and students in the way you devise what you. But this democratization through digital media also has a problem, because digital media is also subjected to state surveillance.
Yeah.
It's even deeper and more pernicious than very often the textual media. We are all aware of that. It can be. So what will happen to textbook itself is something which is still open to question.
Basically, we'll have to see where history takes us in the future.
In a sense, yes. But history just doesn't take us. All social groups, classes, as individual citizens, all of us have to do small bits to make the future, a desirable future.
Thank you so much for your time. I had a great time chatting with you.
Thank you for inviting me to this discussion.